Good evening everybody, this is going to be the 10th video in the Dear Moody series. Can't believe how far we've come, and we're starting to get recognition, and we'll see where we go. So the jacket over there, in case you're wondering what that jacket is it's a jacket from 1994 when I last went on a motorbike. I was lucky enough to go into some training on a motorbike today, BMW 300cc engine bike for an hour, as I'm getting a new motorbike. Well, I'm getting a motorbike. I haven't had one for 25 years. And strangely enough, I could jump on and ride, and had a very nice young tutor, and it was great. So let's just recap and summarize and see what's going on. We're dealing with the so-called policy crisis in South Africa. And I'm writing a video letter to Moody's. And Moody's is considering downgrading South Africa to so-called junk status in November 2019. July, August, September, October. We've got 5 months to convince Moody's not to do this. Moody's say that our policy is terrible, but I can prove that our policy is fantastic, and in actual fact, implementation is bad, possibly non-existent. This video series is basically in 4 sections. The first section is called Policy and Law. The second section, Translation. The third section, Commentary. The fourth section, Hidden Messages. The first section, Policy and Law. We dealt with policy first. Policy is a government's way of saying strategy, and this comes up in a white paper. Law is designed to support policy. So in a business, we form a strategy, and then we form objectives, critical success factors, and we do a whole lot of modeling, and that becomes the law. Everybody follows that law, and everything happens as it should happen. We're going to look at 2 specific people tonight who are on Eskom's latest task team, Eberhard and Steyn, and see what they've been saying to Eskom for the past 20 years, and try to identify why Eskom aren't listening to them, and why do Eskom keep using the same people over and over again, and then not listening to them. Why is it when there are thousands of active citizens like myself who have fantastic ideas and are spending millions of rands on finding alternative ways of making electricity and water embedded in the system, we're not being listened to? And yet, as I said in the first video, the reason why South Africa doesn't have load shedding is because of the immense amount of electrical embedded generation. And the reason why the city of Cape Town didn't run out of water last year is because of the immense amount of embedded water storage in the system. Let's switch to the internet. The 10th of May 2019, last month, Engineering News says the Eskom Sustainability Task Team, which has already had its proposal for the unbundling of the utility into 3 separate units accepted by government, is now finalizing an updated report for President Cyril Ramaphosa, which will include a financial recovery plan for the state-owned utility. This board was appointed in December 2018 and includes Professor Eberhard and Steyn, amongst other people. And so and then there's a bit about losses, that they need 25 billion and they're making losses. And obviously, if you're going to build, a 2 trillion rand system, you're going to have immense capital costs to pay back. If you build a textile factory, you don't make profits for the first 10 years, which means you have to make sure that your cash flow covers your interest charges and all your other charges. If you start a power station which is designed to last 50 years, typically it makes a loss for the first 20 years. For Eskom to put up our electricity prices by 500% in the past 10 years, it's actually ridiculous. Because they're saying, well, we need to cover all of our costs this year, and that's not correct. They need to make sure that in 20 years' time, after they go live with their power station, they fall into profitability. And of course, this assumes that they're going to take 5 years to build. But in fact, they're taking 10 years or more. And if you've read SONA, the State of the Nation address, you'll discover that Cyril Ramaphosa said he's going to split the Eskom into 3, and within 2 days after SONA, which was on Thursday, and it's now Sunday, 3 days later, they're already saying we're not going to do this. We're not going to split Eskom in 2 because the unions are concerned about job losses. But the unions have forgotten, or don't know perhaps, the reason for electricity. Electricity is not for the 50,000 people who work in the electricity industry. Obviously it's important for them, and us and me. But there's 55 million people in South Africa that depend on plentiful and cheap electricity and water. And it's our responsibility to make enough so that everybody has. And if some people at Eskom find themselves unemployed over the next few years, as new systems are developed and implemented, but millions upon millions of people are employed, then that's, in my opinion, the right approach. And those people at Eskom, who are obviously all competent and knowledgeable and capable, will find jobs in other places. After all, Eskom has the most highly paid people in South Africa, possibly in the world, working for it. And one would expect that those kinds of people would not have a problem getting a job anywhere else in the world. So I've scanned this document and highlighted some of it. It's from May 2019. The task team is mulling. I've highlighted mulling because Eskom is mulling. They've been mulling for decades. They're finalizing. They expect further interventions after finalizing. Do you notice a pattern? The financial solution is yet to be finalized and requires further interactions with National Treasury, the Department of Public Enterprises, and Eskom itself. And this is 20 years after Eberhard's first report, which we're going to look at in a minute. There's a unique opportunity to bring some climate-related money into Eskom. But Pravin Gordhan went to the World Bank in 2010 to get climate-related funding and said that we would have renewable energy, as you've seen in previous videos, and that didn't happen. We got the money for the coal power stations, but we didn't build a climate-friendly system. Let's go and look at this essay, Competition and Regulation in the Electricity Supply Industry in South Africa, a paper by Professor Anton Eberhard at the University of Cape Town, written in 2000. Let's go back to the internet and just look at Professor Anton Eberhard for a second. He's a senior scholar with a chemical engineering degree and a PhD from Edinburgh. He works at UCT. He's in the Energy and Economic Growth Applied Research Program. He directs the management program in Infrastructure Investment Reform and Regulation at the Graduate School of Business. A recent focus has been the design of renewable energy auctions. He's worked in the energy sector across sub-Saharan Africa and other developing regions for more than 35 years. And he's the founding director of the Energy and Development Research Center. He has more than 100 peer-reviewed publications. And yet Eskom keep going to Professor Anton Eberhard and they keep ignoring him. Here it is in the National Planning Commission. He was a commissioner of the National Planning Commission, an energy expert, worked in the energy industry for more than 25 years, specializes in economics, management, restructuring and regulation of infrastructure industries, particularly the electricity, gas and water sectors, in support of sustainable development, energy policy, renewable energy, and energy efficient financing and business models. And he's a full-time director for the management program in infrastructure reform and regulation, Graduate School of Business. And maybe what he does works, but Eskom aren't listening to him. They're paying him huge amounts of money for more than 20 years and not implementing his advice. I don't know why they're not, but we're going to go back and look at Anton Eberhard's report from 2000. This report is about competition, and it's for the Competition Commission. And what I'd like to tell you is that the Competition Commission is uncompetitive, because the Competition Commission protects monopolies, as we're going to see in a minute. The electricity supply industry, short name is ESI, consists of four main vertically connected operations: generation, where electricity is produced in power stations; transmission, where electricity is transported at high voltage over long distances. And just let you know, the distance from Johannesburg to Cape Town is the same as the distance from London to Rome. South Africa is a very big country. Then distribution, where electricity is taken at lower voltages over shorter distances to end users. Typically, municipalities deal with distribution. And then supply, where electricity service is sold to customers. In the past, economies of scale and scope led to these different operations mostly being undertaken by vertically integrated utilities, often state-owned and often enjoying a monopoly. Sometimes state-owned, because in America there are lots of utilities, lots of them are private utilities. With new technology, it is now accepted that competition is possible in generation, supply and ancillary services, while transmission and distribution are still regarded as natural monopolies. We need to look at this term natural monopolies, because what it does is it makes an assumption. It makes an assumption that says there's such a thing as a natural monopoly. And who invented this term natural monopoly? Actually, it was the monopolies that invented this term. They said that if they're going to spend these vast amounts of money building power stations and building utilities and building grids, they didn't want competition. And therefore, they would set prices. They created the energy regulator. They created the monopoly. And then they called them natural to exclude other people. And then not only did they create monopolies, they created something called a monopsony, where they said, if anybody happens to make electricity and they make more than they need, only we can buy the electricity. They can't sell the electricity to their neighbor. And here's Mr. Eberhard saying that utilities are natural monopolies, yet saying that competition is possible. One of my other main themes is that to fix South Africa, the fastest thing to fix South Africa, the quickest thing to fix South Africa, is something called levelling the playing fields. And it's something that we're going to look at. The ESI in South Africa used to be regulated by the Electricity Control Board. And obviously it was ineffectual because it was created by Eskom. The utility created its own control board to control itself. And then after the ANC government took over in 1994, they created the National Energy Regulator, which has jurisdiction over the entire industry and licenses producers. And they license and they look at tariffs, but they're really a rubber stamping department because they work for the government. The government pays their salaries. If they were an independent organization, paid directly with public money, funded by donations, then yes, I would say, okay, they actually have a role to play. But now in South Africa, they have no role to play. All they do is rubber stamp, make it look like they're doing something so that their people can be paid. But really, they just rubber stamp what Eskom want to do. And yet, in 2010, NERSA told Eskom that in order to meet your licensing conditions by 2015, you have to make your power stations clean. And this was as the result of 30 years of negotiation, of making the electricity industry clean. So Eskom knew for 30 years, before 2010, that they would have to clean up their act. And in 2015, they hadn't cleaned up their act, and so their license was allowed to continue till 2020. And as we've seen before, if Eskom do not meet their license requirements, and haven't cleaned up their act by 2020, they'll have to switch off a third of their power stations, which means that in 6 months' time, Eskom will switch off a third of their power stations. And Eskom, which is meant to run at 92% efficiency, currently runs at 60% efficiency. If a third of that is switched off, Eskom will be running at 40% efficiency. And we will have load shedding every single day, just like Zimbabwe. And what I've written here is we need to write new law, unencumbered by 100-year-old law. The electricity law in South Africa is 100 years old, designed for monopolies, designed for Eskom, created in 1923, which amalgamated a number of separate utilities into one big utility. Let's go to page 7. Obviously, if there's going to be competition, there's got to be increased private sector participation. And there's got to be restructuring for competition, according to Mr. Eberhard. If new entrants and technologies are to compete effectively, then open, non-discriminatory access to the transmission and distribution system must be guaranteed. And no one generator or supplier should enjoy market power. I 100% agree with this man. But I don't understand why he's still saying the same thing 20 years later. And why? I have not understand why he's saying it, because it's correct. But why is he not being listened to? And why is Eskom continuously using him? We do need new entrants. We do need level playing fields. We do need the small people like me to have the same rights as Eskom and the electricity intensive user group. Page 14. At first glance, the South African electricity supply industry has performed well. Eskom supplies electricity at amongst the lowest prices in the world in 2000. Reliability and quality of supply are good. The national electricity utility is commercially run with no recourse to the national fiscus. Note how everything has changed, with the fiscus currently bailing out Eskom with 25 billion every few months. The industry has accomplished an unprecedented national electrification program, connecting about 2.5 million additional households from 1994 to 2000. And I would argue that this was done by closing the textile industry. If you look at the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs lost in the textile industry from 1994 to 2000, and the amount of, and considering that textiles is energy hungry, well, that was easy. We could electrify 2.5 million households by closing an industry. That's my own opinion. While Eskom has performed reasonably well in the 1990s in practically all important respects, its monopoly position, organization and financial framework and structure of corporate governance has remained unchanged since its apartheid close, and in fact unchanged since 1923. Contrary to popular perceptions, the status quo was achieved at a cost to the state and the economy as a whole. 100% correct. Eskom's recent low prices and exemplary performance has left the impression that it is highly efficient, but actually it's not. Low prices do not necessarily mean low costs. One of the reasons, if we look at the South African electricity supply industry, and the reason why Eskom could be price competitive: low coal prices, really low quality as well, exemption from taxation and dividends, financing subsidized, including subsidized South African Reserve Bank forward cover. This is definitely not a level playing field. And then there was overcapacity. And Eberhard said in 2000 that by 2007, South Africa would run out of electricity. And South Africa did run out of electricity. And we had load shedding in 2008. We need reforms. We need to look at our new power stations, Majuba, which was built on an unstable coal field. They can't mine the coal field at Majuba, and therefore they truck coal in from hundreds of kilometers away. Now we go to page 22. And we look at this. Different models, different policy objectives. The single buyer model, we've heard about that now in 2019. We've heard about open access models and competitive models, but the main thing is the single buyer model will be put in place now in 2000. We'll create a power exchange so people can transport electricity around the grid. It's called retail wheeling. But it didn't happen. At the time of writing, Eskom has only accepted that transmission be established as a separate subsidiary. So in other words, what Ramaphosa said in SONA 2019 was that Eskom would have 3 subsidiaries. It wouldn't be 3 separate businesses. It would still be owned and run by Eskom. And here it is, saying that transmission will be established as a separate entity. But it didn't happen. Eskom has abused market power. It's not a natural monopoly. And the externalities. There's the cost of the environment. There's competition regulation requirements. There's economic regulation. There's technical regulation. There's public interest regulation. And the introduction of competition should diminish the scope for regulation. This is so important. This says that you need regulation when you have a monopoly. But when you have a competitive environment, you actually have less regulation and more competition. NB. Now we go to page 29. And we talk about security of supply. As you know, we don't have security of supply in South Africa. Hence why so many people have generators. Even in the UK, the United Kingdom, there's a vast amount of embedded generators in the system. And one of the things that the UK and South Africa does is something called demand response, where they get hold of one of their customers and they say, please switch on your generator, remove yourself from the grid because we're short of energy. And then Eskom pay that person who owns that generator to run. But you have to have a 1 megawatt generator or more. And there are lots of buildings that have half a megawatt generators. And one of my clients has got a half megawatt generator. And they're not allowed to do what the big companies are doing. Eskom actually pay for these generators to be connected to their grid. They pay a standing charge, a service fee to have this facility available. And then they pay the company to run their generator. So the company does not run the generator at a loss. It says, the South African electricity industry is on the brink of fundamental restructuring, which is aimed at increasing competition in the sector. And we must look at the Competition Commission and the Energy Regulator, both of whom work for the government, and who impeded everything that I've set out in this report. So whilst I believe that Mr. Eberhard is competent, and I believe this report, which I read 15 years ago, and I still believe it today, but you have to ask yourself why it's not being implemented. We then go back to the other guy that's in this Eskom mulling task team. And this man's name is Steyn. Here. I'm not attacking these people. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm trying to understand that these people have got fantastic ideas, fantastic processes, well thought out. And they're on task team after task team after task team for 20 years, working for Eskom, working for the government, working for the Department of Energy. And just like I'm not being listened to, they're also not being listened to. Here's Dr. Steyn, one of South Africa's leading infrastructure and regulatory economists, contributes high-level strategic insight with strong economic and financial analytical skills. I agree, this is a fantastic person with so much more capability than me, being paid by Eskom and not being listened to. I'm not being paid by Eskom, and I'm also not being listened to. But I get that. I'm just an active citizen, trying to see what's going on, trying to understand what's going on. But this man, he's being paid by Eskom, by the Department of Energy, by the government, and Anton Eberhard as well. And they're writing fantastic reports and they're doing incredible work. But the government's not listening to them. Let's go and look at what Steyn said in 2006. The file is dated March 2006. So I'm guessing that this article is written sometime around 2006. And he says, Eskom, are we missing the opportunity to learn from history? It might come as a surprise to you that the current problems with Eskom's power supply to the Cape are closely related to similar problems experienced in the late 1970s and 1980s. It's important to understand history, because South Africa's history and Eskom's history hasn't changed from an electricity point of view, and from a water point of view, and from an infrastructure point of view since 1994. What's even worse is that the causes of past problems were not adequately identified and have continued to contribute to Eskom investment problems and ultimately to the power failures in the Cape. Eskom has not been able to provide the right amount of power since the late 1960s. Well, I mean, one of the problems is if you build a 5 gigawatt power station, or you build two 5 gigawatt power stations, when they come online, suddenly there's a surplus of supply. And it takes a while for that to be utilized. Even though when Eskom build a power station, they need to sell 3/4 of their electricity to big users. So in 2005, when Eskom said we're going to build new power stations, and they started building them in 2010 or 2009 or even 2008, big users, smelters, miners, shopping centers, big industrial users, expected to have electricity in 5 years' time, and that didn't happen. And so not only is Eskom paying for coal that it's not using, it's paying some of its customers for electricity that it's not supplying. It says, after the 1973 oil crisis, Eskom continued to lower its already lower prices. And then it says that because of high demand, the utility was rapidly forced to increase plant orders and to increase prices 70% in real terms between 1974 and 1978. So this is exactly what happened in America. They tried to continue lowering prices, but they couldn't. And their prices actually increased. And actually, from 1890 to 1973, in South Africa, in America, in other parts of the world, electricity prices dropped in real terms. But from 1973 oil crisis till now, electricity prices from coal, oil, nuclear, gas have constantly increased. And here's something very important. Eskom's culture is the same as it was and as it always has been. Eskom totally underestimated the risks entailed in its technology strategy. The rapid upscaling to larger unit sizes, operating at higher temperatures and pressures, was unproven for use with South African coal. Eskom's new generation stations, Arnold, Creel and Matla, experienced enormous operational difficulties with boiler tube leaks and slagging problems, ultimately forcing the redesign of some of the boilers. As a consequence, by 1981, Eskom had to resort to widespread load shedding despite having built new plant. I'm going to say this again. In 2019, it is recognized that larger unit sizes, operating at higher temperatures at Medupi and Kusile, and pressures, was unproven for use with South African coal. Eskom's new generation stations, Medupi and Kusile, are experiencing enormous operational difficulties with boiler tube leaks and slagging problems, ultimately forcing the redesign of some of the boilers. As a consequence, by 2008 and again 2017, 18, Eskom had to resort, and 19 this year, Eskom had to resort to widespread load shedding, despite having built new plant. One has to understand that from a hydraulic, pneumatic point of view, pressure point of view, a steam turbine and its boiler can run at 32% efficiency. But Eskom are trying to run at 42% efficiency. And it sounds, wow, we're going to get a third more power. But we're getting 40% less power. We're getting power stations which are costing 3 times as much as they were meant to cost. They're incomplete. And what's running is running at 40% power and costing 3 times more and being inefficient and not being able to run with South Africa's coal. And as Dr. Grove Steyn says, this happened in the 1970s and it's happening again in the 2010s. Eskom's culture is constantly to build and boast about building the world's biggest power stations, when experienced people can tell you that there are no economies of scale of building a power station bigger than 800 megawatts. And therefore, if you're going to build 9.6 gigawatts, don't build two 4.8 gigawatt power stations. Build 12 800 megawatt power stations. And then, don't start a 100 billion rand construction project before you've tested if you've solved the boiler problems from the 1970s. Spend 100 million rand. Build a small plant. See if it works. Iterate. And when you've solved the problem, then build the big plant. By 1983, Eskom had a generation plant totaling 22 gigawatts under construction. Currently, there's 10 gigawatts under construction. And in the 2020s, Eskom will have to switch off 10 gigawatts and will have to build another 10 gigawatts, which means that 20 gigawatts will again be under construction. Eskom's chief executive, de Villiers, identified problems, but he was ultimately unable to propose an effective remedy. In the past, managers have overinvested in too risky mega power stations with new unproven technologies because of the associated prestige and pecuniary benefits, rather than following more reliable incremental technology and investment strategies that can respond more effectively to unforeseen contingencies. Managers will benefit greatly from upside outcomes and can always avoid the downside risk by passing on the extra costs to consumers. And as I've written on the side, and I've said again and again and again in this series, Eskom's culture has always been to build the biggest and the best. But it's not the best. Managers have overinvested in too risky mega projects so they can boast that they built a big power station, which didn't work. There was the highly speculative payable bin modular reactor where South Africa spent 10 billion rand. An alliance between rent-seeking engineers and misguided politicians, as according to Steyn and David Lipschitz. Why is it possible that this behavior can go on unabatedly? Economists refer to this as a problem of information asymmetry. Whether it was in the 1970s or the 2010s, Eskom's behavior is the same. You would have thought that the ANC government that took over from the apartheid government would have understood this and would have changed Eskom's culture. Eskom's generation planners have consistently been able to bypass NERSA and obtain cabinet approval for plans so that we can have information asymmetry. One of the things that the City of Cape Town constantly tell us is that they have to buy electricity from the cheapest provider. The cheapest provider is currently not Eskom in the Western Cape. The cheapest provider is myself, my colleagues, hundreds of thousands of people making their own embedded electricity and own embedded water at no cost, no infrastructure cost to government, no borrowing cost to government. When we've been trying to sell electricity to the government for a decade, and we said to them, we will sell you electricity at 7 p.m, at 2 a.m. Allow us to buy electric vehicles. Take off the 45% import tariff. We don't have an electrical vehicle industry in South Africa, so why charge this huge exorbitant tariff on imported electric vehicles? And if you do want to know, in 1993, there was a project that had been going on for a decade called SAVE, the South Africa Vehicle Electrification Project. They had a bakkie which could drive from Joburg to Durban with batteries. It was cancelled by the new government. So we could have had the South African electric vehicle industry, and Elon Musk could have actually led that industry with a car that was actually already running in 1993. I think this has been my most forceful presentation so far, video 10. Eskom's culture in the 1970s, Eskom's culture today is exactly the same. They will build the biggest power stations that have ever been built, untested, with unreliable technology, untested technology. They will spend and spend and spend. They will borrow and borrow and borrow. They will tell the government, we need just another 10 billion, just another 25 billion. But when you've been borrowing extra since 2010, the first time I wrote that Medupi should be scrapped. And imagine if 420 billion had been invested in renewable energy, in hundreds of thousands of small power stations, all running 24 hours a day. Imagine if the incentives that were spoken about in 2009 were actually carried out. Those incentives of providing feed-in tariffs. I spoke to a man at Eskom many years ago who told me that Eskom would be prepared to pay private users for demand response. But I could never get enough users together to make it happen. I still can't. And so we have Anton Eberhard in 2000 and Steyn in 2006 saying the same thing to Eskom in 2019 with the same publicity by the government, by President Ramaphosa, by the Department of Energy, by the Minister of Finance. The same stuff, guys, girls, men, women, the same stuff. Einstein has been attributed as saying, if you do the same thing over and over again and you expect a different result, you're insane. Sane has got sanity in it. It has sanitation in it. The Department of Sanitation should provide sanity and saneness. The Department of Sanitation should be the most sane organization. Yet the Department of Sanitation and the Department of Water is also mismanaged, misguided, and has had so many director generals over the past 20 years. Just like Eskom keeps getting another CEO every year. It's time for a change. It's time for Anton Eberhard's and Steyn's ideas to be implemented and adopted. It's time for people like me to work with them to make sure this happens. And if Eskom and NERSA and the Competition Commission do not want to do it, we must find another way to make it happen. Thank you.